In this quick hit, we're taking a look at an artist that tied, then passed the Beatles in 1966 for weeks spent at the number one spot on the album charts. Who could achieve this monumental feat? Well, I'll give you a hint. It wasn't a rock band. Stay with us.
You're listening to a 3324 podcast quick hit with Dean Legiro, where Dean shares stories and trivia about his favorite chart hits, actors, movies, and more.
Welcome, friends, to this 3324 podcast quick hit. My name is Dean Legiro. Thanks for taking some time out of your busy day to spend with us, where in our quick hits, I share trivia and fun little oddity items about the music and movies that we all grew up with and love. And this one is no different. Before we get to it, though, join us on social media. We would love to interact with you there. You can find us at 3324 Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. So once you join us and join the conversation, won't you? We look forward to seeing you there. So we talk a lot about the Beatles in the quick hits, and we've definitely done a couple of podcast episodes about it. But, you know, the Beatles cast such a giant shadow that we can't help but probably talk about them and refer to them multiple times. And I found a very interesting statistic recently that made me have to record this quick hit. It just had to happen. Such a unique and interesting statistic from that year. So 1966, the Beatles were full on. Beatlemania was in full swing. They were dominating the charts. There was no two ways about it. And in one of our earlier podcasts about either our Sgt. Pepper album or Rubber Soul, we talk about the fact that in England, the Beatles would release albums and they would be released in their full form. But for the American market, the demand was so high for Beatle product that the albums would come over to the United States and a couple of songs would be cut off of each album. And then the American market would create a brand new album that didn't exist out of anywhere with all these songs that were taken off of the other albums and were kind of cobbled them together into something else. So in the American market, there were so many more Beatles albums than actually existed because they were made just for America. That being said, in 1966, the Beatles had 3 number one albums. 2 of them were proper albums. One was Rubber Soul. The second album they had that hit number 1 was an album called Yesterday and Today, which was one of those compilations of some of the singles and some tracks from Rubber Soul, and then they had Revolver. So there was 3 number 1 albums that they had. And I'm going to break down the amount of weeks because it's kind of important. Rubber Soul hit number 1 the week of January 8th, and it stayed there for 6 weeks. Yesterday and Today hit number 1 the week of July 30th, and it stayed for 5 weeks. And then Revolver hit number 1 the week of September 10th, and that stayed for 6 weeks. When you add all that up, you get 17 weeks worth of number 1 chart activity from the Beatles between their 3 albums. 17 total weeks out of the year were dominated by number 1 albums by the Beatles, which is pretty impressive for any artist. And it's not surprising that the Beatles would do it. But there was an artist that matched their chart stay and surpassed it by 1 week. Now, who could do that? In the middle of the 60s, who could best the Beatles at number 1 for albums? Well, it may surprise you that it was a trumpet player. Herb Alpert and his band, the Tijuana Brass, known for jazzy pop covers, light Latin-influenced instrumental music, was the one that did it. He was able to do it in 1966. He did it with 3 albums as well. So let's break down what Herb Alpert did to unseat the Beatles, and he did it in a very interesting fashion. So he had 3 number 1 albums. His first album was Whipped Cream and Other Delights is the title. That had already spent 5 weeks at number 1 in 1965, but that doesn't count for 1966. So on January 1st, it was still number 1 for 1 week. Whipped Cream and Other Delights would re-enter the charts in February for another 2 weeks. Then the album Going Places, which was released in 1965, would hit number 1 the week of March 5th for 1 week. It would then re-enter the charts on April 16th for an additional 5 weeks. If you see a pattern here, it's going to stay with the next album. Then in 1966, he did release an album called What Now My Love. It hit number 1 the week of May 28th, and it stayed for 8 weeks. And then it would re-enter the chart on September 3rd for 1 week, which makes a total stay at the number 1 spot 18 weeks. 1 more week than the Beatles did. And Herb Alpert did it a little bit differently. He would stay for a couple weeks, drop off the charts, and then his album would reappear for a week or so at number one. So it's a very interesting story as well, that not only did his albums hit number one, but they would actually leave the charts and then bounce back again and give him a little extra push. If you're not familiar with Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, you should really check them out. It's a lot of great 60s style instrumental trumpet music. They're known for one of their, at the time, very risque covers, which is Whipped Cream and Other Delights. It's got a woman who looks like she's covered in whipped cream and nothing else. She's actually covered in a blanket and shaving cream because whipped cream would not stand very well under the hot lights of a studio. It's an iconic album cover from the 60s, but the music inside is great. I've always been a Herb Alpert fan just from a long time ago, probably because of my parents having those records as well and being exposed to it then. The other interesting thing about the Tijuana Brass is that the band actually didn't exist. It was Herb Alpert would just overdub his trumpets just slightly off so they would sound like there was more than one trumpeter. And then he would use studio musicians eventually, a group known as the Wrecking Crew, who we've talked about in podcast episodes as well, most notably known for working with the Beach Boys on their Pet Sounds album. So this group of high-class precision studio musicians was also working with Herb Alpert. At one point, Herb Alpert's Tijuana Brass got so popular that he had to go out on tour. So in 1964, he actually did have to put together an actual band that would tour. And no longer was a studio creation, and it had to be something that was being able to take out on the road. So there were musicians hired that would become the what's known as the TJB. So that's the story there. Just a couple of other tidbits about Herb Alpert, who's had a really very interesting life. If you're a record aficionado or you've ever looked at the label of a record, cassette, or CD, you may have heard of the record label A&M Records. Well, the A is Herb Alpert. He is one of the founders of A&M Records, home to such artists as Janet Jackson, the Carpenters, and Styx, and of course, his own Tijuana Brass was the very first artist on the label. One final very interesting stat as well about the great Herb Alpert. He's the only musician to hit number one as a vocalist and as an instrumentalist. He sang one song vocally with the TJB, and it's a great song called "This Guy's in Love with You," and that hit number one in 1968. Then, in 1979, Herb Alpert would release an instrumental tune called "Rise," which would hit number one in 1979. So the only artist to hit number one as a vocalist and as an instrumentalist, and able to defeat the Beatles by staying at number one in 1966 for an incredible 18 weeks between three albums, besting the Fab Four by 1 week, but the same amount of albums released by both artists. An incredible and fun statistic that I just came to know, so I was more than happy to share it with you. And now you've got some extra Beatles trivia for your next conversation with your friends about music. So that's going to do it for this quick hit. Again, find us on social media. We're at 3324 Podcast on Instagram and Facebook. Join the conversation there. We would love to interact with you. It means so much to us. And this is Dean, thanking you for joining us. We will see you real soon.
This has been a 3324 Podcast Quick Hit. You can find us on your favorite podcast provider. So please like, subscribe, and rate to become a part of the 3324 family. Your feedback is important, so please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 3324 Podcast and on Twitter at 3324P to join the conversation.